So there we go. Well, welcome everybody. It's so great to have you all here. Becoming Peacemakers is hosting Bob Ross tonight, Dr. Bob Ross, a friend of this group who we've met before. He came and did the talk on boycott, divestment, and sanctions earlier this summer, along with some other panelists. It was such a gift of him to be with us. And yeah, and so tonight we're going to be talking about the struggle against apartheid in South Africa and the role of the U.S. church in that struggle. Um, Bob can tell you a ton about the research he's doing, and that's what tonight will be about. But he's been developing some takeaways from what he's learned from the research that might be able to help us in our work around dismantling apartheid and other places such as Palestine. And I just want to say a little bit about stuff that Bob has done. He's got quite quite the CV, and so just want to mention some of the things so you know who you're dealing with here. Um, but so he's professor of social justice studies and community engagement at Point Park University in Pittsburgh. And he's taught a range of things, including social justice studies, human geography, economic tools for advocacy, economic geography, world geography, global cultural studies, political geography of the Middle East, revolutions, Marx and Marxism, theoretical perspectives, and community engagement. He's published on a number of different topics, including, of course, the South African anti-apartheid movement, Israel-Palestine, urban geography, labor and sports geography, and other topics, including even baseball. So he has a lot of interests, he has many publications, and has contributed so much to the life of the Presbyterian Church, specifically serving a number of roles and leadership positions on different committees and mission networks. So it's really a pleasure to have you with us here again, Bob. And so yeah, take it away. Tell us what's been on your mind.
Thank you so much, Connor. That was such a generous introduction. I really appreciate it, and it's lovely to be with you all. I had such a magical time when I was in New York in June and visited your church and met, I think, some of you at least. I mean, really, that's the word I just kept coming with is magical. I had such a wonderful time. So I wish I could be with you in person right now in Brooklyn, but alas, I'm here in Pittsburgh, which is not so bad. Um, so I am slowly writing a book about the role of American churches in the South African anti-apartheid movement. Um, and that book, not to get too deep into the backstory, but really is inspired by my advocacy solidarity work around Palestine in the church. As Connor said, I've been working with an organization that until Saturday was called the Israel-Palestine Mission Network of the Presbyterian Church, and we just changed our name to the Palestine Justice Network of the Presbyterian Church. Um, and a lot of the work that we've done over the last really 20 years has been around boycott, divestment, and sanctions. And as I was engaging in this work and learning about it, I kept thinking and saying, like, well, what did they do in South Africa? And because people would say, like, well, this is, BDS, boycott, divestment, sanctions, is based on um, some of the tools that were used to help end South African apartheid. And there's some folks, some of the elders that I've worked with were part of that movement. But what I learned is no one had written a book about it yet. People have written a lot about the anti-apartheid movement, but no one's written a book about the role of American churches in particular. And the more I learn, the more I realize how much churches, and when I say churches, everything from denominations to local congregations to grassroots church organizations in America, this solidarity role. They weren't necessarily the most important um, members of this movement, or um, and they weren't perfect either. They made some mistakes. But one of the things I want to talk about tonight, and one of the takeaways, is that the church then and now had a lot of power, and they used it. And they used it in solidarity with South African struggle to end apartheid. So I don't know if this is a good idea, but I'm going to give a pretty big overview tonight, starting from like what is apartheid to um, the role of churches in the U.S. and then some of the lessons that I think we can learn from that movement. And I'd love to hear from you all as well. Um, I want to ask you a question. I'm not going to put anyone on the spot, but who here is familiar with South African apartheid?
I am.
All right. Most people, some people a little bit here and there. So I graduated high school in 1994. That was the year that apartheid ended. That was the year that Nelson Mandela was elected president in a, by all accounts, free and fair election. And so I grew up with apartheid in the news. And I do remember certainly hearing about Nelson Mandela and Desmond Tutu. But the older I get, um, the more I realize younger folks don't know much about apartheid unless they really sought it out. So, like, I teach a class on South Africa, and then the first day of class, I ask the whole class, like, who here knows what apartheid is? And usually, like, one person raises their hand. So, um, I want to just start from that sort of 101 level tonight. And if this is a review for you, apologies, but I want to just sort of start from the assumption that this is new to you. So I'm going to share my screen here. Let's see. Hmm, Where are we here? Okay. I think 1 second before I start sharing. I think I have to do something else here. Okay. And I think, Connor, we'll have some time for questions and discussion at the end. Is that right? Okay. Let me ask also before I go any further, how many people here were in whatever small or large way a part of the anti-apartheid movement? Maybe you attended a protest, maybe you, okay, a couple of you, awesome. A few of you, great. Um, all right, can you see a slide that says the church and the anti-apartheid movement?
Yeah.
Awesome, awesome. Let me go here. All right, let's start from the basics. Connor, am I the only host? Do I have to admit people into the room? There says someone's in the waiting room. Or are
I
you
think
covered?
you're done. You're good. Thank you.
Okay, great. All right. So what is apartheid? Um, and by the way, when I was in South Africa, I learned all my life I've been pronouncing it apartheid. That's how it's usually pronounced in the U.S. And my South African friends said it rhymes with hate, apartheid, apartheid. But if you want to call it apartheid, that's fine. Um, so apartheid is a legalized system of white supremacy and racial capitalism that was intended to separate and hierarchize this South Africa's population by race. And the word apartheid is an Afrikaner word that means literally separate or separation, to separate. And if you ask, back in the day, if you look at documents that the apartheid government put together, they they celebrated this is we're separating the races so that each can flourish and each can develop and won't be influenced by the other in a negative way. Um, but it was certainly imbued throughout with white supremacy and this idea of not just separating the races, but putting them into a hierarchy. Um, Principally what makes apartheid is that there is legal separation. And I'll get into this in a little more detail, but everyone in South Africa was legally classified as one of four races, no matter how complicated their lineage might be, white, colored, Indian, or black. And sometimes black was referred to as native or African or sometimes Zulu, but legally, native Africans were had the same racial categorization, same rights. A lot of Americans, for good reason, are perhaps triggered or just they ruffle their feathers when they see the word colored. Um, this to this day, the South Africans, many South Africans still identify themselves as colored. I think the closest thing in the U.S. this would be like mixed race. Um, in South Africa, there is a large South Asian population, and there has been for quite some time, and they've all been lumped together as Indian. Um, but the important thing is that everyone had on their national ID a race. Um, and this became complicated when maybe you had a white mother and a black father. What race were you? Well, you fell into one of those two categories, or perhaps one of three categories. And there were different laws for different people based on their race. And one of the principal ways to identify someone was through this passbook. And by law, everyone had to carry around a passbook that had their name, their race, and you can see this woman here. It says Zulu. Um, and this passbook determined where you could be, what you could do, where you could work. And it was by law, everyone had to carry a passbook, but really it was the black population, or really the whole non-white population that had to carry a passbook everywhere. And you can see in this picture, a police officer checking someone's passbook. Anyone who knows anything about Palestine right now, for quite some time, Palestinians have had to carry around basically the equivalent of a passbook that determines where they can go and where they can't go. There was also geographic separation, geographic segregation, we might call it. And so, principal to this was the creation of what were known as Bantustans or homelands. And so, different African nations were people were put into different African nations and subsequently into different places, even as a lot of native Africans did not really identify principally with their ethnic tribe or nation. They may have just identified as black or many just as South African. Um, they were given these so-called homelands where they had to live. Uh, Generally on the worst soil, so farming was really difficult. Um, and they were, um, people were uprooted from their homes that they may have lived in for generations and moved to these homelands systematically over the years. And the geographic separation also would be localized. And so within cities, many of the cities, they still had racial diversity because um, unlike Palestine, the white minority depended on um, black labor, and so there was this sort of this is the central contradiction really of apartheid in South Africa was the white population wanted to separate, and I should mention you may know this already, but um, somewhere depending on what year you're looking at, between 10 and 20% of the South Africa's population was white, and so they were in the minority and still are. They wanted to segregate themselves from people who weren't white, but they were dependent on people who were not white for their inexpensive labor. And so this is a map of Cape Town, and you can see where how Cape Town was divided racially as well. And then even looking at a more micro scale, places like bathrooms were segregated by race, beaches, train stations, et cetera. And so this is very much like Jim Crow South in this case. And you literally couldn't be in one place or another based on your race. Um, Principally, also in apartheid was separation of labor, separation of workers, in a policy called job reservation. Your race determined what sorts of jobs you could have. I won't get into the complexity of South African history, but there were two principal white populations in South Africa. There were the British South Africans, and then there were what were called the Afrikaner South Africans. And the Afrikaners were descendants of Dutch, German, and French migrants. And there's a long history of their oppression at the hands of the British. And part of what made apartheid was that the Afrikaners finally reached power, and they wanted to, in addition to uphold these norms of white supremacy, they wanted to separate themselves from the British, and they wanted to make sure that they could get some good jobs. Well, in any case, what happened was that you have this hierarchy of economic classes and specific jobs that was based on race, and so you could, your opportunities in the workplace were determined to a large extent by your race. All right, getting into resistance. Who resisted apartheid? A lot of people. But I want to try to simplify this a little bit. Internally, within South Africa, the principal resistance movement within the country was the African National Congress. This is the party of Nelson Mandela, Albert Luthuli, Oliver Tambo. And this is the party that is in power in South Africa right now. And I'll talk a little bit more about them in a moment. There's also a Pan-Africanist Congress, which was a group of people from the ANC who broke off and a little bit more leftist, a little bit more, I mean, it's implied in their name, they were Pan-Africanists. And in other words, they didn't um, believe so much in South African nationalism. They believed in this idea of Pan-Africa as a continent that should be free of European dominance and European colonialism. But it was still never a very dominant party or resistance movement within South Africa. By the 1980s, the ANC and the PAC and a number of other organizations and political parties united as the United Democratic Front. And this was a beautiful moment in many ways in South African history where um, they recognized they had a common enemy and they recognized that they're only going to defeat this enemy if they band together. So they created this United Democratic Front. Um, the South African Council of Churches is really a central part of um, this history as well. And South African Council of Churches over the years, over the apartheid years, was initially white, then mixed race. And this was where Desmond Tutu first sort of gained national prominence within South Africa. And they played a pretty significant role. South Africa is an overwhelmingly Christian country, not just in terms of numbers, but also just the sort of the cultural importance of Christianity. And so apartheid, and we could have a whole class about this, apartheid had its own theology. The Afrikaners who created apartheid, they based it in this theology of apartheid that God wanted the races to be separate and so forth. And the South African Council of Churches played a really important role in developing counter theologies to that theology. And one of the key documents that they wrote was the Kairos document. This is, I think, in 84, 85. And this was really published for the world. And it was a theological grounding of why apartheid was wrong and why and how it needs to be ended. And it was a call to action both for South Africans, but also for the rest of the world. Some of you might know that Palestinian Christians created their own Kairos document, and it was really inspired by and modeled off of the Kairos document. And in fact, some of the authors of the Kairos document worked with some of the South African authors worked with the Palestinian authors of their own Kairos document. Um, Externally, outside of South Africa, to oversimplify things, the independent governments of the global South, particularly in Africa, the nation states that had gained independence, um, were the first to resist South Africa in a number of ways, economically, militarily, just ideologically, and really were the most consistent and stalwart throughout the history. And this also includes a lot of Asian countries and Middle Eastern countries were resisting South Africa, resisting apartheid from the beginning. In the global north, churches, students, labor unions, peace organizations, anti-racism activists, this whole rainbow of folks, institutions, organizations, and individuals gathered in various ways to resist apartheid. And the governments of the global north, and I know that's an oversimplification, but the governments were very late, and the United States government was one of the last, along with the United Kingdom and Israel, to really come out in a meaningful way against apartheid.
No surprises there.
Right, exactly. Um, so how was apartheid resisted? Internally, within South Africa, throughout its history, there was a civil disobedience, and for the first um, several decades of the African National Congress's existence, they were really committed to nonviolent civil disobedience. Um, Everything from sit-ins to Um, they had this defiance campaign where they refused to carry their passbooks around, marches, etc. But in 1960, the there was a nonviolent march where people in across South Africa, and they marched to the police stations in each of their towns and said they left their passbooks at home and they asked to be arrested. And the idea was this was really clever. They knew that the white minority depended on their labor. And so they thought if we could clog South Africa's jails, we'll break the law by not carrying our passbook. They'll arrest us and the economy will shut down. Um, what happened in one of these protests in a small town called Sharpeville is the South African police opened fire on these unarmed protesters and killed, I think, I want to say 69 and injured many more men, women, children. Um, and this was in 1960. This did two things. This woke up the rest of the world. Before 1960, um, South Africa and apartheid were not really in the headlines or in people's minds outside of Africa. But this was on the front page of newspapers across the world, and this really sparked the anti-apartheid movement globally. Internally within South Africa, many activists concluded that nonviolent resistance alone is not going to win them freedom. Okay. And so the African National Congress turned to targeted armed resistance. And when I say targeted armed resistance, at first they would just target infrastructure and or symbols of the state. This escalated over the decades to become I wouldn't say targeted at anyone, but targeted at um, institutions and soldiers and police officers and so forth. So that was from 1960. They still engaged in civil disobedience. But another thing that happened is that um, after 1960, the um, the apartheid government just began banning any sort of resistance movement or political organization. And by banning, it just meant like they legally could not exist and arresting many of the leaders. And so most of the African National Congress then was in exile and operated from exile. And so anything that was happening within the country was underground. Um, Important uh, to our purpose tonight and the role of the church, particularly in America, was in 1958, the African National Congress, and I know I'm going out of order here, the African National Congress, along with several independent African nation states, called upon the rest of the world to use economic means to pressure the South African government to end apartheid. And so they called upon institutions, countries, organizations to boycott any sort of South African products, to boycott relationships, diplomatic or economic, cultural relationships with South Africa. They called on countries to issue sanctions. They called on institutions to stop investing in South Africa. Um, Albert Luthuli, the president of the African National Congress at the time, also won the Nobel Peace Prize, said the economic boycott has unlimited potentialities. When our local purchasing power is combined with that of sympathetic organizations overseas, we will yield a devastating weapon. And so this was a clear call to the rest of the world to use this economic power that people had. South Africa was not an isolated country. It was, like most countries, part of this system of global trade, and they knew that it depended on foreign investment, on imports and exports, and they saw this as a way that they could really hit the heart of the apartheid government. So externally, outside of South Africa, people took up this call in various ways and to varying degrees in different places. And so this looked like boycotts. It looked like shareholder resolutions, which I'll talk about a little more in a moment, divestment and mass withdrawals. And by mass withdrawals, I mean specifically banks, like people taking their money out of banks that were funding or were lending money to apartheid. And this ultimately meant sanctions for governments to place restrictions around what sort of economic activity could take place between South Africa and their country. In the United States, Connor mentioned that I like baseball, and I've written a little bit about baseball. This is one of the coolest things I've learned about the anti-apartheid movement. One of the first Americans to speak publicly and call for a boycott and divestment and sanctions was Jackie Robinson. Jackie Robinson had recently retired from baseball. Um, when did he retire? This was in 1962, I think. Maybe it was 1960, somewhere between 60 and 62. I think it was 60. Yeah, because it was just after Sharpeville. And he was part of an organization called the American Committee on Africa. And he was the keynote speaker, or one of the keynote speakers. And he had this great speech calling on athletes to not compete against South African teams, called on businesses to stop doing business with South Africa, called on people to boycott and so forth. Um, so I thought that was very cool. Jackie Robinson was one of the first. If we look toward the church and that which transcends the church, Martin Luther King was one of the after Jackie Robinson was one of the first public figures to publicly call for BDS. And so in 1965, in a speech he gave in London that was broadcast across America on the radio, he said, "Our responsibility presents us with a unique opportunity. We can join in the one form of nonviolent action that could bring freedom and justice to South Africa, the action which African leaders have appealed for in a massive movement for economic sanctions. Why is trade regarded by all nations and all ideologies as sacred? Why does our government and your government in Britain refuse to intervene effectively now, as if only when there is a bloodbath in South Africa or a Korea or a Vietnam will they recognize a crisis? If the United Kingdom and the United States decided tomorrow morning not to buy South African goods, not to buy South African gold, to put an embargo on oil, if our investors and capitalists would withdraw their support for that racial tyranny that we find there, then apartheid would be brought to an end. Then the majority of South Africans of all races could at last build the shared society they desire." And so this is just amazing that King was saying this as early as 1965. And in fact, the speech that he gave was just the audio was just unearthed about 5 years ago. You can find it. Democracy Now! Broadcast it I think it was in 2019, they broadcast it. You can find it on their website or on YouTube. Um, so that was 65. In 1966, you might be familiar with Union Seminary in New York, put together the first successful divestment campaign. In 1966, there were a couple Union students who learned that the Bank of Morningside Heights, which was the bank that all the just about all the Union Seminary students and other students in the neighborhood and the institutions banked in. This was First National City Bank, which later became Citibank. They were lending money to South Africa. They learned that there were 10 banks that had this line of credit, basically like a credit card that they issued to South Africa to borrow money. And these two seminary students discovered that, and they started this campaign. First, they organized Union students, then they organized Columbia and Barnard students and Jewish Theological Seminary students. And on one April morning in 1966, they together marched from Union Seminary down to First National City Bank, which I think was at 110th and Broadway. And this is a picture of this action from the New York Times, where they all one by one closed their account with First National City Bank and explained why. They said, "We don't want our money to go to apartheid." So they closed their account. The movement grows beyond Morningside Heights. It grows to the rest of the city. Chase Manhattan Bank is targeted, and other institutions beyond just the Morningside Heights institutions get involved. The students stay involved and they start targeting churches. At this time, most of the Protestant denominations had their headquarters in Morningside Heights at 475 Riverside Drive, which is still to this day called the God Box. And this picture on the left is actually a picket line outside of 475 Riverside Drive, where young Methodists were protesting the Methodist Board of Missions, which had something like $10 million invested in these banks. And they eventually got the Methodist Church to withdraw their money and move it to another bank. And this is actually a really important part of the movement. The students were very clear. They said, once you withdraw, you should invest in a bank that does something good for the community. And so they found two banks in Harlem that were lending money to black home buyers, to small businesses in the neighborhood there, and they encouraged everyone to move their money from one of these big, huge banks and put them in one of these Harlem banks. The Episcopal Church ends up moving all of its money. The campaign escalates to 1969 when the United Nations moves all of its money out of, they were invested in Chemical Bank, which was one of these banks. And I don't know if the United Nations then invested one of the Harlem banks, but in any case, they moved their money out. In November 1969, the South African government announces we are no longer, or the banks acknowledge we are no longer lending money to these banks or to the South African government. And so this was just like when I learned about this, I just thought this is really a wonderful campaign. It's a victory, the first divestment victory that I know of. And so this happens 66 to 69. It was not the end, of course, of apartheid, but it made an impact. It reached the South African government. They needed to respond to this. In the 1970s, after the bank campaign, the denominations, and actually a lot of the denominations then were staffed by former union students who were part of this campaign. And so they had been sort of struggling against the denominations in the 60s to get the denominations to move their money out of these banks. And many of them then got jobs in the denominations. And thankfully, instead of just falling into these relatively cushy jobs and going on their way, they continued their activism. And so what churches, one of their principal functions in the 70s and 80s, and really all the way through the end of apartheid, was to file shareholder resolutions. And so churches then, like now, have millions of dollars invested in various companies, just like any employer does, like because of a pension fund, or in the case of churches, they often have like a foundation. And what they would do is so they're shareholders of these companies, and so they would file resolutions at companies' annual meetings and say, well, we own 12,000 shares of stock of General Motors. This is what the Episcopal Church said in 1971. And as shareholders, we want you to stop doing business in South Africa. And these shareholder resolutions, they never got more than maybe 10% of the votes from shareholders, but they put the issue of apartheid on the table, and it had to be discussed at these meetings. And there often would be protests outside of the meetings, and then these church executives inside would give these impassioned speeches about what this company is doing to support this system of white supremacy in South Africa. Um, Another campaign that was going on that I think was quite powerful, and it involved churches in, I wouldn't say a peripheral way, but only partially. And this was a campaign called the Campaign to Oppose Bank Loans to South Africa. In 1976, on June 16th, 1976, there was probably the second biggest, well, at the time, maybe the biggest massacre in South Africa. There was an uprising of students in Soweto, outside of Johannesburg, and again they were met with live gunfire, and um, and this turned into this months-long uprising of students against the apartheid education system. And again, this kind of woke up the rest of the world. And so in 76, one response was a group of union activists, church leaders, mostly grassroots church leaders and local churches, and anti-racist organizations, peace and justice organizations, banded together and decided to go after the banks that were lending money to South Africa. because the Union campaign did not end lending to South Africa. It only ended this one line of credit. And so this was a campaign that was localized. So there were different chapters all across the country and in Canada. And it was modeled very much after the Union Bank campaign, Union Seminary Bank campaign, where people would close their accounts with these banks and then would say why, and they would try to get institutions to do this as well. And they had quite a bit of success. And this, coupled with the shareholder resolutions, which were targeting not just banks, but all sorts of companies. This forced a good number of banks to end their loans to South Africa. This was particularly true among regional banks. I mean, think about you know, uh, like First National Bank of Charlotte, North Carolina, or something like that. This is a local bank, and they're sort of dependent on their local customers, and they might have be part of a small loan to South Africa. It was relatively easy for a bunch of account holders to get that bank to stop lending money because they were more dependent on these small account holders than they were on this one loan. And so it did have quite a lot of success. And another really important part of the this campaign was that um, they they did not focus just on South Africa. They didn't focus just on apartheid. They also looked at banks that were contributing to redlining in American cities. They looked at banks that were lending to the Pinochet government in Chile, and they and this enabled them to build larger coalitions. So like maybe um, there was an organization. I mean, in in Harlem and in Bed-Stuy, there were organizations that were focused on redlining, and so they partnered with the more South African focused organizations to target a bank that was making these sorts of bad loans. Um, and this campaign like gained a lot of steam. Um, Sort of an offshoot of this was the creation of the International Freedom Mobilization, starting in 1979. The African National Congress recruited a black New York Episcopal priest named Wyatt T. Walker to organize black churches in solidarity with the African National Congress. And so Wyatt T. Walker organized, and I've seen like his mailing list, just organized black churches, not just across New York, but across the whole country. And the sort of first manifestation of this was this conference in New York called the Summit Conference of Black Religious Leaders on Apartheid. And they did everything from contribute to the coalition against bank loans to South Africa to individual protests and marches. This picture on the right is a protest, a march that the House of the Lord Church in Brooklyn made across the Brooklyn Bridge down to Wall Street. And you can see they had kids and adults, and this was to put pressure on businesses to stop doing business in South Africa. Arguably, one of the most important things that the International Freedom Mobilization did was to introduce Desmond Tutu to American churches and to the American public. Desmond Tutu had visited America as early as 1971, but he was not a household name, even in black churches in the 1970s. He actually came to Union Seminary for a conference and gave a paper there. Um, but what the IFM did was to really put him on a stage, sometimes literally, and Tutu then took this and made this the bank campaigns and divestment campaigns, not just national news, but global news. And of course, all of this, I should say, there's parallel campaigns going on in places like the Netherlands and the United Kingdom and Canada. But Tutu was really focused on the U.S. And we really have the International Freedom Mobilization to thank for that. And so in the 1980s, well, starting in 1978, but really in the 1980s and into the 90s, these major denominations start to divest. They sell their stocks of any company, bank that was doing business in South Africa. Um, And interestingly, this was the probably the height of South of divestment was 1985. Does anybody know who started his second term in office as president of the United States in 1985? Who was just elected in 84?
Reagan.
Reagan.
Yeah,
Reagan.
this is Reagan. And this is what I was thinking about the day after the election last week. It was during Reagan's second term that the greatest achievements of the anti-apartheid movement in the United States were took place. And so we have the Episcopal Church, the Lutheran Church, the Methodist Church, the Presbyterian Church, these Catholic religious orders and archdioceses all pulling their money out of companies that were invested in South Africa. And what this did, in addition to like put South African apartheid center stage on front pages of newspapers, it also put economic pressure on the government of South Africa, and it scared these companies. And so companies before they even were divested from, companies were pulling out of South Africa because they didn't want to face divestment by, these institutions like churches were to collectively multi-billion dollar institutions. And it wasn't just churches, it was also state and municipal governments. The city of New York, the state of New York, the state of California were divesting their pensions from companies that were invested in South Africa. And as these companies start pulling out of South Africa, and as the banks stop lending money to South Africa, this puts the South African economy into a tailspin. And the writing by about 1985, 86, the writing was on the wall. And sort of the culmination of this in America, actually, before I get to the culmination, let me talk about the Presbyterian Church for a second, since y'all are in a Presbyterian Church. Presbyterian Church in 1985 came up with a plan called selective phased divestment, where they divested from companies one by one, which was a painstaking way to do this and arguably a regressive way of doing this. Most of the other denominations just said any companies any company that's invested in South Africa we're divesting from. Presbyterian Church started with four, and then they went to six, and then they went to eight. And they wrote this up, as Presbyterians do, in this long study called Divestment for South Africa and Investment in Hope. And to this day, that document guides the denomination's divestment policies of how it does divestment. And this is why if anyone's ever engaged in this, whether it's over fossil fuels or for-profit prisons or Palestine, it takes a long time to divest from a company in the Presbyterian Church. But nevertheless, the church did divest from several companies that were doing business in South Africa. So the culmination is in 1986, as some of you might remember, the United States finally passes a sanctions bill on South Africa. And churches were by no means the only players in this movement, but they did lobby for sanctions. This is on the left here. This is a photograph of people in the Brethren Church writing letters to Congress, their Congress people, urging them to pass a sanctions bill. Tutu, of course, was advocating for sanctions. Denominations were passing resolutions calling upon the government to issue sanctions. And for those of you, I'm sorry, I don't mean to assume you are familiar with sanctions. Sanctions basically means it's some form of limitation of what a country's businesses can partake in relationship to another country. And so in this case, it meant that companies could not invest in South Africa. They couldn't lend money to the South African government.
Can you repeat that again, please? Your definition per se.
Sure. So sanctions is a set of laws that a country issues that prohibits certain economic activities from taking place between businesses in their country and another country. And so in South Africa, this meant that, or the United States sanctions meant that banks could not lend money to the South African government, which is what the coalition against bank loans to South Africa had been pressing since 1976. It meant that companies largely could not invest in South Africa, although there were loopholes and ways around that. It meant that American arms manufacturers couldn't sell arms to the South African government. It meant that people could not buy South African gold or South African diamonds, which were really the cornerstone of the South African economy. And so this was the sort of crowning, I'm losing the metaphor here. It was the crown achievement. The culmination of this movement really was the U.S. At this time the largest economy in the world passes sanctions on South Africa. Most other countries in the world had already passed sanctions on South Africa, but it was significant because the U.S. Had such deep economic ties with South Africa. And once this happened, um, it just it's not that people knew apartheid would end, because there was still, in fact, the South African government's response initially was to crack down and be harsher and more draconian against their black population, particularly anyone who tried to resist it. But um, people knew that the economy couldn't last under all of these economic pressures. So I'm skipping the conclusion here, really, and that is that by 1990, um, F.W. de Klerk, the president of South Africa, announces that apartheid will end, that Nelson Mandela and all other political prisoners will be released, that the African National Congress and all other resistance parties and movements will be unbanned so they can operate freely and they can run candidates for elections. And then in 1994, South Africa holds its first free and fair election, and this is where Nelson Mandela is elected. This is not the end of the story. South Africa still exists under I think the greatest economic inequality in the world, of any country in the world, as the biggest gap between the rich and the poor, and that wealth inequality is largely, though not entirely, racialized. The white population generally still has most of the wealth. The black population, the majority, still generally has most of the poverty, with some movement in between. Political power is held by the African National Congress largely, although there are some other black political parties that have uh, made considerable gains. But Desmond Tutu said toward the end of his life that, we basically still have apartheid. So um, it's not, I don't want to suggest that apartheid ended and the rest is, they lived happily ever after. But no one, of course, no one who suffered under apartheid says, we want to go back to apartheid. So this is a victory. And I love teaching this to students because, it's one of these rare moments where social movements, grassroots movements really grew and developed so much power that they could change an entire global world order around a particular country. So let me just conclude here with some lessons that I think we can learn, but I would love to hear from you all and any questions you might have. And as I said before, so much of this for me is inspired by learning. So much of learning this is inspired by my participation in the Palestine Solidarity Movement, the movement for Palestinian liberation and freedom, and of course, right now, and just an end to the genocide. But I think most of these lessons can be applied to any movement, particularly a solidarity movement. So I think the first is the parable of the widow and the judge. If you're familiar with this, I'm not a theologian, so ask Connor for a deeper theological analysis of this. But this is the story of the widow who comes to the judge and pleads and pleads and pleads and pleads and pleads, and the judge just gets so annoyed he finally gives in, and she gets what she wants. And I think this is, when I read that passage now, I think of the South African anti-apartheid movement, how they just kept pressing and pressing and pressing over decades. People devoted their entire lives, and people in South Africa died for this. And so I think that's a lesson I think any of us can learn from this is just the need for determination and fortitude and stamina. Um, Two, the church has power still to this day, tremendous economic and moral power. I know we don't like to think, or we think often when we think of like church and money, we think of that as a negative thing. I think this is a potentially positive thing. Denominations, the Presbyterian Church alone has, I want to say like, I think it's $11 billion in investments. Um, there are institutions with much more economic power, but I mean, the fact that we have access to this institution and democratic access to how this institution uses its money, that's power that we shouldn't leave on the table. And we also, I think, and this is arguable, but I think the church still has some moral power. Um, the church has lost a lot of that moral power because of a lot of the mistakes that have been made, but we still have moral power to speak up, to speak prophetically, whether as individuals, as part of a church, as pastors, as a denomination. We have this power, and we should use it for good. Um, Not to get too deep into the weeds, but when we look at um, divestment, and I'll try to explain this. I would say corporate disinvestment is the aim of church divestment. So when a church divests, this means they sell the stocks of a particular company. And they do that in the South African case with the goal of the corporation disinvesting from South Africa, right? To put economic pressure on the corporation so that the corporation puts economic pressure on the company. And this might look different in different contexts, but I think often in the case, if we look at the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement in Palestine, um, there's often sort of a fetishization of the tactic of divestment. And I think we have to realize like we want what's next. We want the corporation to withdraw so that there's even more pressure on the government. Number four, delegitimize false theologies with better theologies. And so, as I said before, apartheid was supported by this theology of apartheid. And you can read about it. There's lots of books about it. And South African Christians, Black South African Christians, and not just Black South African Christians, some white South African Christians, articulated theologies that were in their eyes, and I think in many people's eyes, including my own, were truer to what they knew of the gospel. Um, and and I think that's important for any. I mean, we're facing a president supported by white Christian nationalism. Um, there are theologies that support the sort of the white nationalists policies of Trump. And I think we as a church in America need to articulate, delegitimize those theologies as false theologies and come up with better theologies and promote those. And you don't have to be Connor or a university professor or a seminary professor to do theology. I'm saying that as a layperson because I can't like write papers about theology, but I think anyone can talk about what the gospel means to them, and where we see public policy in line with the gospel and where it runs astray. Number five, I think with any movement, when we are in solidarity with people, we need to listen to those who are oppressed. So in this case, the Americans, whether it's American Christians or not, they generally listen to South Africans for guidance. Um, the churches and other institutions that engaged in boycotts and divestment and sanctions did so because all the way back in 1958 and consistently throughout apartheid, South Africans were saying, please use these tactics. And so I think as best as we can, we need to listen to those who are on the front lines of these struggles. Number six, one of the lessons I think is that the anti-apartheid movement, as far as the church goes in South Africa, worked with ecumenical, interfaith, and secular partners. It wasn't just the Presbyterian Church or a particular parish within the Presbyterian Church. They worked across different faiths. They against different denominations, and they weren't afraid to partner with organizations that were totally secular. And I think that's really a strength and really a necessity, especially now where the church is, despite what I said in point number two about having power, we do have diminished presence in the social world. And so I think it's absolutely important that we partner with people outside of our faith. Number seven, connect international struggles with local campaigns. And I think the committee's bank loans to South Africa did this really well, as I was saying before, to show that there's a connection between a bank profiting from racism in South Africa and a bank profiting from racism in Harlem. And we have to do our research and figure out where these connections are, but um, it it shouldn't be a case of like we're just going to focus on this going on in some other part of the world and ignore what's going on right in our own neighborhoods. I think there's strength in connecting those struggles. And finally, as I was alluding to before, it shouldn't matter who's in the White House. And this is for me the right now this week and last week, what's hitting home to me that we can't give up on these movements just because a extraordinarily conservative Republican was elected to the White House. These movements pressed on, and we need to as well. All right, I'm going to stop there, and I'll stop sharing my screen. I can also share these slides with you if you want. They're all on Google Slides. And I apologize, I didn't see any of the comments. So maybe Connor, you can help me navigate all this. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you so much, Bob.
Oh, that was wonderful.
Thanks.
So yeah, let's do some question and answer. I think Kimberly's the first one with their hand up.
Well, that was great. That was awesome for me. Thank you for all that. My deeper understanding about apartheid. I mean, I was on the HBCU campus of Norfolk State way back in from 84 to 89. So, definitely not having a real good understanding, but knowing on a very light level what was going on. Perhaps had I been at Yale, like Nate, I would have had a deeper understanding, but that's a whole nother discussion. My understanding comes pretty much from maybe within the last 15 years from watching Have You Heard from Johannesburg, the documentary. So, which filled in a lot of blanks or whatever. So yeah, first and foremost, thank you for that. So that's I'll yield the floor because that's a lot. That's a lot. And my questions might pop up. Oliver Tambo, I mean, I could be incorrect, but just from what I've learned, he needs to be given more credit. He needs to be just as high up on there. And I guess Sazulu, if I have that name correct, he probably could use more recognition too. But he needs to be just as high up as Mandela. But okay. So anyway, all of this is so timely in what we're dealing with here from last Tuesday. And then again focusing on Gaza and Israel and Bibi and all that kind of stuff like that. And I'm still kind of torn because I have Jewish friends. So it is, to me, it's a convoluted situation. So there.
Thanks, Kimberly. I really appreciate that. Thank you. And yeah, for the rest of you, like, Have You Heard from Johannesburg is it's like an 7 or 8 part documentary about the anti-apartheid movement. I think my library, I have access to Canopy, and I think you might through the New York Public Library.
I bought it.
Oh, you bought
Okay.
it. All right, go to Kimberly's house.
It was important enough to me to have that background information and to be able to see it and revisit episodes over and over and over again if I wanted to, that I purchased it like maybe 6 or 7 years ago.
Awesome. Yeah, it's really great.
Yeah, my understanding is there was a significant movement within South Africa amongst the white citizens, anti-apartheid. And I'm trying to remember, there was a group of women that that demonstrated. Do you recall what that was? I'm
It's
not
Black
quite.
Sash. Black.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
Okay.
yeah. And it definitely, and I don't want to give the impression that it was, you know, it was just Black South Africans resisting. And definitely white South Africans, colored and Indian South Africans were resisting as well. Yeah, the Black Sash was a great group of white South African women. Yeah, thanks for that.
I had a question. My
Yeah.
name's Derek, and thanks so much, Bob Ross. I really appreciate it. I kind of followed it and was involved in student activity to kind of get involved in divestment and to promote it as someone in high school at the time, but I did not have as in-depth an insight or knowledge that you just kind of showed today. So thanks for that.
Mhm.
I think that what's interesting for me is I look at the parallels between apartheid and the occupation and the mechanisms of control that exist in Palestine and the state of Israel. And if you look at what's been happening in our government over the last five, maybe longer, but I certainly in state governments, it's almost like they took notes on what happened in the BDS movement and
Mm.
took some preemptive steps to legally like make it extremely difficult to implement divestment and achieve sanctions and so forth. And I was just wondering like if you had any thoughts, maybe seeing these trends yourself on how
Mm.
to respond to those efforts and those obstacles.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. Like, I think one big difference between South Africa and Israel is that South Africa did have like propaganda and they did some dirty things like they bombed not just resistance within South Africa, but like in the UK, they bombed an anti-apartheid office and um, yeah, they engaged in that sort of thing, but it was nothing to the scale of what the counter resistance in Israel is doing, both within Palestine and Palestinian society, but also abroad. And so it is so much harder. Um, and I think like we have to recognize where our power is. And I do think like, the first day when Donald Trump's inaugurated, I'll write to him. And I think we all should continue, pressing on again, the widow and the judge, we just got to keep knocking on their door. But realistically, like we probably have more economic power than political power right now. And by saying we have economic power, I mean not at least not me as an individual. I don't know about y'all, but like collectively and institutionally as a denomination, Presbyterian Church still has this power. And who knows, like maybe your labor union does if you're part of a union or your workplace or whatever. So I think that's where we can exercise some power, and we do still have to so far the legal right to boycott, to divest, and at least to ask for sanctions. In fact, like the United States is breaking the law right now by not issuing sanctions on Israel. And this is something, I mean, I don't know if anyone heard if there was a vote today, but they were going to vote. Um, no, I know what it was. A month ago, Biden said if Israel doesn't allow more humanitarian aid into Gaza, he's going to stop transferring arms. Today was the deadline, and all of the aid organizations in Gaza said Israel has failed to open up aid. And the State Department today said, "Well, we think they're doing a little bit better, and we're gonna keep issuing aid. And what's at stake here is American law that says if U.S. weapons are used, um, you know, I forget
Yep.
exact wording, but like we have
Just
to them
yeah,
off.
oppress people. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's so clear,
Hmm.
but yeah, it's hard. It's really hard. But I do think like yeah, we recognize the power that we do have and the power that we potentially have, and yeah, it's I don't have like a happy answer to that.
What are you
But
suggesting? What does it sound like? It sounds like you're suggesting something without really being forthright. What I mean, I'm just trying to push you to say if I could be wrong.
say that again, Kimberly.
Um, you're saying that a civil, what do you call it? Civil, what do you call it?
Disobedience.
No, civil society.
Mm-hmm.
As civil society, as a populace, as American people per se, we have more power because maybe you're saying that let me see, I read it down. You said we have more economic power. I guess the US has more economic power than political power, but are you talking about those of us who are part of the civil society have,
Yeah,
and by way of this US being our country, there's more
yeah.
economic power?
I think if I'm understanding your question correctly, I'm saying like in particular the movement for Palestinian freedom and liberation and so forth in the United States, we ordinary folks in civil society who are part of that movement have economic power that is or the potential to have economic power. America as a whole, of course, has like tons of economic and political power, but if I'm talking about like this movement, this social movement, we have access to power insofar as we have connection to these to our church denominations, to our various institutions, and it's a matter of like how do we tap into that power? How do we wield it? And I
Well,
think
we have a new administration coming in who seems to be sympathetic to BB, to Nana, who, whatever. So we're taking that in consideration.
yeah, it's a steep
What is that?
hill to climb.
Yeah, I had a question about the. Okay, apparently Union Theological had a very active role. Did they have company? Were there other seminaries and seminarians who were actively engaged in the movement back in those days, or was it kind of singular?
Union was definitely like way ahead of its time. The Union students, the Union Seminary as an institution didn't divest until 1979, and they only did it like sort of piecemeal. By the 1980s, most of the Protestant mainline seminaries like Princeton, McCormick, so forth, did divest. And so Union was not the only, but it was certainly ahead of its time.
Hmm.
Bob,
Yes.
you mentioned that the United States was breaking the law by continuing to provide armaments to Israel. Is that really a law or just an agreement or a regulation or what?
It's called the Leahy Law. Um,
Okay.
and I'd have to look up the details, but it basically says that the US can't continue transferring, whether it's giving away or selling weapons to another country
Hmm.
if that country is using those weapons. I forget if it's like, you know,
Okay.
how they're using them exactly, but like basically against sort of
Yeah.
humanitarian
Who would
principle.
have standing to challenge that law legally in court?
Congress.
That's a good question. Yeah, maybe Congress. I don't know. I mean, it's,
Oh, Congress. Our Congress, sure.
right.
It's
It's
12 months ago.
probably, it's the criminals investigating themselves, I guess.
Yeah.
But
I had a question,
yeah.
which was one thing was just like a little note. The woman and the judge. It's interesting in that story, the judge says he gives in to her, not just because she's so annoying, but because he's afraid that she will attack him, which
Ah,
I'm always kind of returning to these multiple forms of resistance and where does was armed struggle fit in all of this? And of course, it has a place in this struggle. And in that story, yeah, the ruler is afraid of being attacked by her, and that's why he gives in. But yeah, I'm interested in like if you have any thoughts about like because being in the US seems so committed. I don't even think personally I really understand what exactly the US is getting out of this relationship, out of this just completely unconditional support of Israel and every single thing it does. Like I get the outpost of empire, the laundering money through weapons, all that stuff. But at the end of the day, like it just still feels like more expense than it's worth. Um, I don't quite understand that, but it feels pretty immovable and feels like any economic threat that we can pose can be compensated for by the state. Like it's just something that the state will always find ways of ameliorating or or managing. Um, and just a little addendum within that, I interesting. We're talking about like economic struggle being nonviolent too, and I'm like it are sanctions, is divestment, are these kinds of things nonviolent um in a way that, right, because like Emily brought up Cuba, right, and US sanctions on Cuba are unquestionably violent. And so is
Mhm.
this too, this is an aspect of violent warfare, and Christians don't
Mhm.
get to get out of the thing of like, oh, we're not being violent by participating in economic warfare. It's still warfare.
Yeah.
But so just that kind of more philosophical point. But I'm wondering if you see anything in terms of the kind of BRICS realignment of global economic and political power, if there's any hope that maybe that contingent or grouping as some kind of counterbalance to the US can provide an economic threat to Israel, to apartheid in the occupied territories, or is that not high on their list of interests from what you can surmise?
Yeah. Gosh, I don't know. I mean, I think you raise a lot of really interesting, good points. I think first things first, and these are definitely, they can't be mutually exclusive, but like we need to stop the bleeding, like we need to stop um, the war. And I think that the Israeli public is largely against the war. They want it to end. They're not dumb. Like they know that the hostages are not going to be returned through armed violence. It's only going to be through a ceasefire. And I think like so there's that. And I think um I don't know about like I don't think like even the BRICS countries, the what is it, Brazil, Russia, China, um
Yeah, China, South Africa.
yeah. I don't know even if they were all aligned on this, if they would still be able to um I mean, they wouldn't have the same power that the United States has. I mean, I think what we have, like politicians, politicians care about being elected. Corporations care about making profits. And I think when politicians learn, if and when they learn that they're not going to be elected, if they don't oppose Israel, then I think they'll change. Like, I don't think individual politicians don't care about anything. I mean, some of them do, sure. Um, and then corporations, I think, just if we use South Africa as an example, the corporations supported an end to apartheid when it hurt their bottom line. Individual corporations, and amassed to like 150 or something ended up withdrawing. And so I think if corporations see um, that their bottom line is significantly going to be hurt if they don't grant Palestinians full rights, I think they're they have all the power in the world, or most of the power in the world. The problem with that, it's sort of a catch-22, because what happened in South Africa is then transnational corporations basically took over South Africa, and the International Monetary Fund in particular forced the new African National Congress government to radically reorient its economic plans to favor transnational corporate investment. And so it's not just like in South Africa. I mean, it's not going to be an easy fix, but I do think like there are ways out. And I think focusing on that, like yeah, the interests of politicians and the interests of corporations, it's all we can do. And yeah, it seems pretty bleak right now. We're up against a huge wall.
Mm-hmm. But let me bring up a related issue, if I may, which is kind of, I guess, semi-abstract. But that is, if we look at what's happening in Europe right now, I think the activities, the pogrom that's taking place in Palestine is causing the always latent anti-Semitism in Europe to emerge. Mm. And what has happened in Amsterdam, I believe, is probably just a minor symptom of activities that are occurring in other European countries. So I'm just wondering if that in any way might impact the decision making and the resolve of the Israeli leadership. What do you think? Am I being naive, or do you think that that might impact the strategy, their strategy?
Yeah, I mean, the Israeli government isn't afraid to partner with anti-Semites. I mean, Hungary, for example, Viktor Orban, the president of Hungary, is just a rabid, explicit anti-Semite, and yet he's this strong ally of Israel and of Donald Trump. And we're talking about the Israeli government here, and I think like we've already seen like, and there are conflicting reports of what happened in Amsterdam, but let's just take it at face value. The Israeli government is exploiting the perception of anti-Semitism for its own needs. You know, see what's happening here. This is why we need a strong Israel. And so I don't know if that's exactly what you're asking, but I think they're using and I like let's be clear, anti-Semitism is real. I live in Pittsburgh where someone shot up a synagogue a few years ago. Mm-hmm. And we need to condemn it wherever we see it. But it's also, yeah, it feeds into, I think it helps the Israeli government in a perverse way.
I had a question, and that kind of speaks to Rich Green's point. I feel like right now in the world, the most anti-Jewish force in the world, the most anti-Jewish dynamic in the world is actually the government of Israel. People like Ben Gvir, Smotrich, and Netanyahu himself, and how they're prosecuting this war is actually very anti-Jewish. And so that's one thing. And then the other thing, I'm really trying to emphasize anti-Jewish as opposed to anti-Semitic, because linguistically, all the Semitic religions are ironically Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, right? And I'm just wondering the role that language has played in both cases in South Africa and in the state of Israel and the land of Palestine, like these kinds of distinctions that are sort of absent, but maybe get hijacked and utilized. Did you notice that in your study? Like a lot of misinterpretations of the land, the geography, the renaming of spaces and things like that. Could you talk a little bit about that? Did that kind of pattern show up both in South Africa's apartheid? And then you see that, obviously, there's a lot of examples of that in Palestine, Israel.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I forget who said it, but someone said, some historian said, the modern nation state of Israel, one of the best propaganda moves they made was to name their state Israel, right? Because like for us Christians, like we sing songs about Israel and, you know, it's like inescapable and this is the land of Jesus and so forth. And like call your country Israel and like nobody's going to criticize that, right?
And
it's
Zion.
Like, right. And I think that's really powerful. And yeah, I mean, I think language is really key. In South Africa, it's interesting and more complicated. Like the apartheid government was largely Afrikaner speaking, and a lot of the key black anti-apartheid figures insisted on English, and they learned English from their European missionary teachers. which is like kind of throws our understanding of like the role of missionaries in the global South into a new light. And so the battle, like Soweto, the uprising in June 1976, was about the language of instruction in the schools. And the apartheid government wanted black kids to learn Afrikaners and only learn, or yeah, only learn in Afrikaans. And they were like, no, we want to learn English, you know. And so yeah, it's and I that sort of linguistic struggle I'm not as well versed in as many other people are, but I think it's definitely part of it. Yeah.
Were they successful in lobbying for English as a language?
Eventually, yeah,
Okay.
eventually, but not, I mean, after many people killed and arrested, yeah.
Emily, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I just want to both personally thank you. You've gone through a lot of my history between studying linguistics in the 70s and talking about Afrikaans and Zulu and whatever and Xhosa. But in the American Committee on Africa and the divestment movement and the parade down Fifth Avenue and Nelson Mandela came to town finally. So just a personal thank you for this history, which is so critical to for us all to know and really important to the way you've tied it into personal. So I just want to thank you for that. I also want to say that again, the propaganda, the Amsterdam thing started when Israeli soccer fans grabbed and burned.
You're muted, Emily. Emily, you're muted.
Sorry.
That's
I'm just saying the Amsterdam thing. My hand is clenching here. It started with when Israeli soccer players grabbed and burned a Palestinian flag and attacked a Muslim cab driver. You know, and then from then on it snowballed. But the news stories that's buried down in the bottom of the thing. And it's just to me one more example of how we conflate anti-Zionism and anti-Jewish, anti-Semitism, and anti-Israeli. You know, it's don't let other people make your definitions for you.
Yeah, amen. Thank you for that, Emily.
Well, I have a bunch of questions, but I have Bob's phone number, so I can just bother him with my stuff. And y'all can too. Y'all, I don't know if you have his email, but if you want it, I'm sure he'll be fine with me
Definitely.
connecting y'all. Because there's so much more. I mean, I know Bob works on this, and there a bunch of questions have come into my mind that I didn't have before, especially with all this new context. And I'm sure that's true for a lot of us. So we'll get to keep unfolding this conversation with Bob as a resource. But want to respect Bob's time and y'all and let y'all go for the night. And so thank you all for being here, and let's just give a thank you to Bob for being with us tonight and helping us understand this topic. So yeah, thank you all for being here. Thank you to Bob for sharing with us, and let's keep working. Have a good night,
Yeah,
y'all.
thanks, Connor. And thanks,
Thanks,
everyone.
Bob.
It's so
Thanks,
great to
Connor.
be with you all.
Great evening. Thanks, everyone.
See you.
All right.
Peace.
Good night, everyone.
You.